what I discuss with a lot of people too is if they don't understand the technology, they're afraid of it, so that's why they don't produce it. In other words, the U.S. has some possession of certain, call it alien technology, but they don't understand it and they can't figure it out as far as a control point. Can't control it. They're not going to admit that they have it because basically they don't know how to control it. So they'll be first embarrassed to the rest of the country, their fellow country people. And second, if it did get in the hands of an enemy state, let's call that an enemy state, and they were able to re-engineer or control it, then they have control and the trump card as far as now they have the upper hand as far as it could be. It could be just technical advantage, or it could be technical advantage towards their military development, etc. So now, why are they coming out? And why is he trying to come out? He's playing. They're playing chess here. So I'm going to produce a piece here on a chess set and make a move, and let's see if the U.S. is going to follow. Who's going to play whose bluff? There's rumors that they have something just as equivalent to what we supposedly the government has here. But to me, I think in either situation, neither one of them understand what they have, or they just can't. They can't figure it out because we're not there yet with our discovery of science yet. So we're just, we're just very basic to what we're doing compared to something that just happened to, like I say, hover by here for some reason. You have other conversations, and you say, if you roll the clock back 50 years and you look at the present state of technology, like I said, you got basic radio, basic TV, which has really been developed from Marconi and Tesla and Edison back in the late 1890s. So they just kind of some way control it. Still use the same law of physics to transmit a signal like a radio. But now we're in 2015. All right, so we got all these new fancy devices that we package, media and all this stuff. But it's not that it's only not that much of a major advantage in technology compared to how many hundreds of thousands of years we've been on this planet as a different species of Homo sapiens and stuff. Going back before that. So in other words, if we were kind of progressing 500,000 years ago, we should be maybe at the era that this maybe alien technology that we have at the same level. You guys follow what I'm saying? In other words, we should maybe be understand what they're doing, but since we're just really in the last 75 years came out of the stone age for 75 years ago. If you think about it, I mean, you go back 50 years or you go back 75 years. I mean, there was stuff that we had back then wasn't mind-breaking, or it wasn't it wasn't so incredible. It was just it was limited what we could do. We could still do limitations of today. We're still running around with cars with that's still running combustion engines, and still runs on this rubber material or tire. That they did back in the 50s, the 60s, the 40s, the 30s. So you see what I'm saying? I said we're still in a very slow pace here. Now, if they do have such a let's call it a technology piece to the country, and again they don't understand what to do with it, that's a problem. That's what I would be too. How could I admit to the public, we have a possession of some kind of technology system, but maybe there were some kind of occupants with this, with this system, but we can't explain it how it works. We can't figure out how it operates. We don't know how it's made out of. And then just think, the rest of the population go, geez, they don't know, Mr. Government. There must be something really frightening about this, like they don't understand. So I think maybe that's the reason for the complete still hush to this day. Not because people are naive and, well, we don't know what a UFO is, but I just think if we don't understand what it is, and we can't, it makes sense for them not to publicize it until they could get some kind of handle on it.
Right, you know, that's true. I didn't realize that, so that does make sense.
Yeah.
You know, I just assumed it was they're just trying not to like basically freak out the public, but
right.
I mean, again, that makes more sense.
That's right. It does, because you know the first thing, you know, you look up to the government. See, the government, because I do a lot of defense stuff too for the government. They usually work about 20 years in the future. So in other words, some of the technology they're using today is really like 20 years advanced as far as on some of them, you know, some of this stuff. I'll give you an example. I have a couple of, but I call them duds. But when I was working for a third major defense contract, now there's only not even a handful of the big ones. You know, you have Raytheon, you have Lockheed Martin, you have BAE Systems, right? You have Boeing. So I work for BAE, for example. So if you just Google BAE Systems, there are not many other business but defense development, defense for the government. Now, of course, there's BAE, the UK, which is the parent major company, the mother company, or Department of Ministry of the D.T.M. But over here, for example, I'll give you. Now, this is Internals is classified by kind of the product set. In other words, if you kind of want to look at this product set, that's kind of like almost like a marketing flyer is available on the net, so which means it's it's available for the public. So here's a product called Wolfpack. It's called Wolfpack. What you do is, what these devices are, they drop out of a plane, and they're basically almost like just picture a hockey puck, a regular like NFL hockey puck, and you stack about 7 of them, and it's about the size of this one Wolfpack. Now, what it's got into it, it's basically got built-in GPS. It's got a built-in acoustic sensor system, and it has we call a WiMAX. In other words, not Wi-Fi, WiMAX chipset, which basically could really transmit a good 5 miles, no problem, as far as a signal. But now all this stuff is high-speed data and encryption. Now, what the purpose of this thing is, you could deploy about 7 or 10 of them in one we call one cluster. It's like one little area of, I would say, the middle of some kind of countryside somewhere where it's like no man's land. And they could basically they come down, they come off an aircraft, and actually there was a small parachute that slows them down. But the footprint about it is, it looks like a bird on radar. It doesn't even look like anything of interest on a radar. So you got some surveillance radar, we call secondary radar. It doesn't pick it up. There's some kind of, wait a minute, what's this object floating down? You know, like a balloon or something. So what they do is when they hit the ground, whatever, they basically they kind of self-adjust to be in a perfect position. So they're kind of like, well, what happens if it falls upside down? It kind of aligns itself where basically it tilts itself up again. What's the purpose of these devices? They can pick up and sense movement and what type of equipment is being moved. Like, for example, like a campaign of vehicles, such as a convoy. To be a military convoy. So, for example, this would be that perfect application where ISIS is on the move. So you drop these things around in Iraq, and you can actually, besides our UAVs, high-power reconnaissance up there, you scatter these things around, and they're really hard to find, too. They're not like they stand out. They kind of camouflage into the part of the contour of the Earth, depending on where you're going to plant these things. Some of them are sandstone color and stuff. They blend in with the terrain, depending on what you're going to do with it. Now, these are what I'm not trying to push this product, but this product, Wolfpack, basically it's a self-sensing network, acoustical analysis type of system to figure out what kind of footprint of some whatever vehicles are running around, and it sends this data back, and this data gets decrypted, and then it can figure out what type of machinery is floating around there without any presence, without any, from about 1,000 miles away. It gets the data far enough where you get some low orbiting little satellites that pick up these pings and the data from these devices. Like I said, it uses WiMAX, and it uses some of the UAVs swing by and pick that data up, from if it's lower level. And this is what the government has as far as technology toys. Now, so you can see something like that. There's a lot of R&D behind, a lot of money behind it. I'm talking couple more than a few $1 million. But this is something that blows people's minds, right? Can you imagine that? So
right.
a lot of their stuff, like I say, they're usually 20 years in advance. Now, similar, they got some other stuff that called the grasshopper that could shoot up into a cave and look in it and actually look through the rock structure with special infrared systems. There's something that they could look underwater called hyperspectral imaging, which could actually go below the surface and actually track submerged submarine from the sky. So and then you got like 125 megapixel cameras on some of these pods in the planes. They could take some high definition. Oh my God, images. So if you take the alien technology, that's this thing 1,000 times fold than that, in 1,000 years ahead, and then you can see how the government doesn't know what to do with it because they can't understand it, and we lose. Imagine our confidence in the government, that we lost confidence that these guys can't figure it out, and they have the greatest. They have the greatest technology. That especially when they do demonstrations like air shows and stuff. What the hell, us? Well, how are we going to defend ourselves if this thing gets out of control?
Right.
Yeah. Right.
Wow.
Now you just imagine. So that's the whole thing. Because people say, well, why won't they say it? Why won't they release it? What's the problem? We're not ignorant. We know what's going on. So it'd be nice to know we have a neighbor nearby. Yeah. The problem is we just don't understand what the neighbor is, and that's the frightening part about it. So suppose the neighbor, suppose this device transmits out and says, okay, it's calling its distant cousins to come visit now, and all of a sudden we're in an attack mode. I mean, just think about it. Could you imagine like that? Who knows? But it's just, you got to kind of, you kind of have to look at the whole picture and go, all right, so what's the reason? Another guy,
right?
People.
Yeah, I was looking at it as a more simpler reason, but again, not knowing everything that you just schooled me on, I, obviously would have had no idea anyway. But that's really, really interesting. Definitely gives me a different view of it now.
It
how
is.
Do you respond if the government were to let the information out about aliens, so forth and so on? How do you think the general people would respond to that?
Like I say, some people might have a real problem. Like I say, if you think the government's a shield for you, in other words, they're here to protect the homeland of let's say the United States, and all of a sudden now you feel that they have no control, they don't understand this. Now there's no shield, there's no protection anymore. So it's kind of like what happens if you get an invasion and we can't do anything about it. It's like where do you hide? Every man for himself. So you would cause definitely a lot more mass panic. People know that our own government can't help us. That would be pretty pathetic, but that's the real situation. So like you say, Iraq, we got what's going on. Like or ISIS comes over